David is waiting. King David is waiting at the city gates of Mahanaim. And there he sits and waits, waiting for news of his son, Absalom. And why is it that King David is sitting at the city gates of Mahanaim, waiting for news of his son, Absalom? Well, it was like this. The story is a tragic one. The first time we meet Absalom, the one thing we know about him, first of all, is that he hates his brother Amnon, because Amnon has done a terrible thing, cruelly abusing his own sister Tamar. But the second thing we learn about Absalom is that he is a cunning so-and-so, because he never drops a hint to Amnon about how much he truly hates him. Instead, he waits. And he waits for 2 years until the right moment when he hatches his plot, fools David, kills his brother Amnon, and then runs off into exile. And David, what does David do? Well, David does nothing. He does nothing to punish Amnon for what he did to Tamar. He does nothing to support his daughter, Tamar, and he completely ignores Absalom. So Absalom is waiting. He's waiting for David to do something, anything, either to pardon him and bring him back home or to banish him for good. But instead, David does nothing. So, in exile, Absalom is waiting and waiting. Eventually, David's general Joab fools David with a clever ruse and twists David's arm, so eventually David brings Absalom back from exile. But amazingly, even when he's back home in Jerusalem, David continues to ignore Absalom. So Absalom is kept waiting. So the king said, "Let him go to his own house. He's not to come into my presence." So David just shuns him, ignores him, and Absalom is left waiting for David to do something. Are you waiting? Are you waiting for somebody to do something? Say something? Anything? If you're a student here at Newbold, are you waiting for that fellow student to take just a bit more interest in you? Apart from that shy smile you exchange each time you pass one another. But instead, they seem to be more interested in economic theory or Greek verbs, and you're just left waiting. And waiting was one of the great frustrations I had when I taught here at Newbold. As a lecturer in the theology department, I got to know some students very well. And these were the students who always kept me waiting for their assignments. There was always a good reason. There was either this emergency or that emergency. There were never any emergencies at any other time of the year, just when the assignment was due. It was always their computer that crashed on the day it should be submitted. It never crashed any other day of the year, just when the assignment was due. And so I was left waiting. It was so annoying. Now, unless some of us might feel sorry for Absalom, it soon becomes clear that we wouldn't want to have him as our church pastor. We read here about Absalom that when he cut the hair of his head, for at the end of every year he used to cut it, when it was heavy on him, he cut it. He weighed the hair of his head, 200 shekels by the king's weight. Now, Absalom is a handsome brute, but he is obsessed by the fact, and the pride of his life is his hair. He weighs it. When he is shorn once every year like a prize sheep, 200 shekels worth. I don't know how many of you have done that when you've been to the hairdresser. You say, would you mind weighing that for me? 25 grams more than last year. Better put that on Instagram. A little while back, I had the pleasure, when I went to get my hair cut, of being served by Tracy. Tracy was a young apprentice hairdresser. And obviously the proprietor of the business had said to Tracy, Tracy, it's always a good idea to engage customers in polite conversation. You know, it's good for business. So as I sat down in the chair and Tracy looked down upon my crown and surveyed the task ahead of her, her first words to me were these: you know, sir, it's not really that you're bald. It's just that you're thin all over. Now, let me assure you that Absalom is not thin all over. He has a luxuriant forest of dreadlocks. Absalom is a handsome narcissist with ruthless ambition and a head of unruly hair. If that reminds you of any politician that you may know of, I'll leave that to your imagination. But in the case of Absalom, I think we can say that his pride and his vanity has almost literally gone to his head. And in the meantime, Absalom is waiting. He's waiting for the opportune time to strike and achieve his life's ambition. He goes cruising around Jerusalem in a chariot with 50 outriders. He stands at the city gates and meets aggrieved citizens and says to them, I see your point. I can see why you're not happy. You know, if only I were in charge, I might be able to help you. But of course, as it is, my hands are tied. His ambition, completely transparent, but David cannot see it. And he still can't see it when Absalom concocts a cock and bull story about having to go off to Hebron in order to make a vow to the Lord, and David just lets him go. And the king said to him, to Absalom, go in peace. So he got up and went to Hebron. Now, as most of you know, the Hebrew word for peace is shalom. And we call this character we're looking at Absalom, well, we call him Absalom in English. In Hebrew, his name is Avshalom, which means father of peace. So David says to the father of peace, go in peace. But peace is the last thing on Absalom's mind. For these are the last words David will ever speak to Absalom. And Absalom strikes immediately, declares himself king, and attracts to himself celebrity defectors, such as Ahithophel the Gilonite, David's chief counselor. David flees from Jerusalem just in the nick of time as Absalom is entering the city gates. And two characters give Absalom advice. On the one hand, the profound wise man and astute tactician, Ahithophel the Gilonite. On the other hand, Hushai the Archite, David's undercover agent in Absalom's court. The traitor, Ahithophel the Gilonite, gives Absalom shrewd advice. He says, "My lord, your father David is a beaten man. His troops are demoralized. You cannot give him time to lick his wounds. No, my lord, you must strike, and you must strike now. Send me out with the army right now. I will sort out David. I will kill David, and the kingdom will be yours." Now, this is sound political and military advice. But Hushai the Archite, David's undercover agent, knows his man, and he appeals to Absalom's vanity. He says, "Your Majesty, your father David has a fearsome reputation as a warrior. You cannot allow just anybody to go out against him. No, my lord, this requires time and planning. No, my lord, what we need to do is to take the time to gather together the greatest of your troops so that they can be led by a charismatic leader of exceptional ability. And while we are waiting, my lord, we will then call on you, and you will lead the troops in a devastating episode of awe, shock and awe, in order to demonstrate to the entire nation your greatness and your might." And Absalom thought about Hushai's advice for a split second and said, "Right, I see what you mean. Let's do it." And so while Absalom delays, David heads off for the city of Mahanaim. And David stations himself there at the city gates as his troops march out, as they go off to engage with Absalom. Now, the story gives hardly any space to the battle, but it concentrates almost entirely on Absalom and his hair. And we see him hanging in a tree with 200 shekels worth of hair entwined in its branches. David's general Joab finds him, kills him, buries him without ceremony. But David doesn't know. David hasn't heard. And so David is waiting. King David is waiting at the city gates of Mahanaim. And there he sits and he waits, waiting for news of his son, Absalom. This isn't the first time in David's story that he has been waiting for news from the battlefront. The first time was when he was waiting for news about Uriah the Hittite, whose death he had plotted on the battlefield. And when he was waiting for the news concerning Uriah the Hittite, the news is delayed and delayed and delayed, and the same happens here. David sits and waits at the gates of Mahanaim, waiting while the news is delayed and delayed. So 2 battles, 2 deaths. First, Uriah the Hittite, this time Absalom, and in both, David is kept waiting and waiting. And the reason for that is that the Bible wants us to wait too, so that when we come to David's response, we know what we have arrived at. Dear reader, please take special notice of this. When the news arrives concerning Uriah's death earlier, David gave this callous response. David said to the messenger, "Do not let this matter trouble you, for the sword devours now one and now another. Don't worry. These things happen." But then finally the news of Absalom's death comes. And how does David respond to that? The king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." It was told Joab, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom. So the victory that day was turned into mourning for all the troops. For the troops heard that day, the king is grieving for his son. The king covered his face, and the king cried out with a loud voice, "Oh, my son Absalom! Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." And so it came to pass that when David heard that Absalom was slain, he wept and wept and wept, because he realized it was now too late. That's why the king was deeply moved. With the death of Absalom, we get no flippant remark like he did with the death of Uriah, "Do not let this matter trouble you," for the king is mightily troubled. We get a repeated, heart-wrenching wailing, "Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." And David is not simply weeping for Absalom. He's also weeping for himself. He's weeping for a life of lost opportunities, of a failure to be the father he should have been, and the realization that it's now too late. It's too late to be the father he should have been. And the key to that, I think, we see in what David calls Absalom here in this episode. At the beginning, just as the troops are going out through those city gates of Mahanaim off to the battlefield, David gives them this command. He says, "Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom." The young man, the language is distant, formal, diplomatic. And then the first messenger arrives, and Absalom asks the question. He asks, "Is it well with the young man, Absalom?" The language is still formal, still distant. He doesn't get a straightforward answer, so when the next messenger comes, he asks again. The king said to the Cushite, "Is it well with the young man, Absalom?" And this time, he is told that Absalom is dead. And now Absalom is no longer the young man. He is now my son, my son, my son. He speaks personally, emotionally. Throughout the whole story of David and Absalom, which takes up about 6 chapters of 2 Samuel, David only refers to Absalom as my son on one occasion. He is always the young man, or After his rebellion, David calls him the king, but never, never my son. Only here after he dies, and then he can't stop. Oh, my son, Absalom, my son, Absalom. Would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son. The king covered his face, and the king cried with a loud voice, "Oh, my son, Absalom! Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." He can't stop because it's now too late. When David heard that Absalom was slain, we enter his personal tragedy, a tragedy of a man who waited too long to do the right thing. And when he heard that Absalom was slain, he realized he'd waited too long. So he wept and wept because there was nothing else he could do. In the story of David and Absalom, like many biblical narratives, we find our own lives writ large in the experiences of these biblical characters. And not just our personal experiences, but the corporate, communal experience of the church as well. One of the most successful advertising campaigns ever in the UK was done by BT back in 1995. And in 1995, BT had been given the great honor of being awarded the award of being Britain's most hated company. So they decided they would try to turn around their fortunes, and they started a memorable campaign which essentially boiled down to just a handful of words, which were, "It's good to talk. It's good to talk." And from then on, their fortunes and their share price went upwards. It really sums up David's problem. David found his son Absalom just too difficult to work with, so he stopped talking to him, with tragic results. And increasingly, we aren't talking. That is, we're not talking in the church, or rather, we are talking to those people with whom we agree, and then rather ignore the people with whom we disagree. For example, in the Adventist Church, we have two theological societies. One theological society who group together to look at things that way, and another theological society who group together to look at things that way. And as you've noticed, there's many Adventist websites which essentially do the same kind of thing. Those who contribute to Spectrum, you never find them on Fulcrum 7. And if somebody contributes to Ad Vindicate, it's unlikely they'll ever appear on Adventist Today. There is less dialogue and much more monologue, where we each confirm our own prejudices that we are right and the others are wrong. But I would think that spiritual maturity is shown not simply in loving those who agree with us, but how far we can love those who disagree with us. And if we cast the net in a slightly different direction, how many tragedies could have been avoided in the history of the Adventist Church if collectively we had had the maturity on occasions to say, sorry, we got it wrong. We didn't do what we should have done. We'll do everything we can to put it right. Please forgive us. And not just collectively, but personally. How many personal tragedies, how many personal heartaches and stress could I have avoided in my life, and could we have avoided in our lives with our families, our friends, our loved ones? How much of that could have been avoided if I'd simply been willing to say, sorry, look, I know I was wrong, and that now, right now, is the time to fix it, rather than waiting and waiting until it's too late. Because if we, either as individuals or the church corporate, fail to learn from the lesson of David, I think we are doomed to repeat David's tragedy. For, as you will recall, when David heard that Absalom was slain, he wept and wept and wept.